So, busy week in the headlines this past week, starting off with Biden releasing his budget. Overriding theme, three little words: tax the rich. What's interesting about that is that earlier this month, the IRS released its tax data, as it does each and every year, for sort of the most recently completed year. And in this case, it was statistics for the 2020 calendar year. So we're going to share those with you. And, well, I believe you, the listener, are pretty intelligent. And we're going to let you draw your own conclusions as to whether the tax data matches some of the things that you hear in the mainstream media. Perhaps, as a country, both Democrats and Republicans, we need to come up with something a little bit better than like a soundbite, like a three-word type of thing of how we're going to solve all of these problems. And tax the rich, 3 words, that just is probably not going to get us there, especially when you hear this tax data information. So we'll tackle that problem here on the program. Plus, we'll talk about the disturbing trend of the significant increase, almost 40%, in hardship withdrawals on 401ks in America today. How to avoid, along with the solution of how to avoid using your 401k as your emergency savings. So welcome on into the program. This, of course, is Dollars and Cents, where we help you make sense out of all of life's decisions involving your dollars. One of Central Florida's most listened to radio programs, coming to you from a variety of stations across the Central Florida region. Also out there on the internet, coming to a worldwide audience as one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts. If you're not connected to us on your favorite podcast platform, well, then we ask why not. In order to find us, go to our website, Nelson Financial Planning, upper right-hand corner. You'll see the icons. Click on the one that looks most familiar to you, and you'll get instantly connected to our channels, whether that's on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube even. Make sure you subscribe to us so you know when we upload new content to any of those platforms. My name, of course, Joel Garris, Certified Financial Planner, Certified Financial Fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning. So before we get to all of that, March, or sort of where we're sitting now during the month of March, marks the 1-year anniversary of when the Federal Reserve, in its infinite wisdom, decided to start raising rates. So hard to believe. It seems like they've been raising rates for a while, but the reality is it's only been just this past week. Markets, meanwhile, were all over the map, if you will, particularly reacting to the testimony that Chairman Powell gave this past week before Congress, some suggestion that, okay, if the data continues to trend in the current direction, then perhaps we will go back to raising interest rates by 0.5 percentage point. Certainly some of the data that has come out creating some head-scratching decisions, or I guess some head-scratching moves, if you will, that the Federal Reserve is confronted with, because when you look at the data, stronger than expected labor numbers continue to dominate the headlines. Unemployment reached a 53-year low at 3.4%. So that's a very different kind of scenario than what you would typically expect after having raised rates as much and as often as they have within just the past 12 months. To put that into further perspective, the labor market at the end of February, the 7th week in a row that weekly initial jobless claims were below 200,000 claims. So certainly some data that continues to suggest that there is some strength in the underlying labor markets. As we've mentioned on the program before, we think some of that could be the demographics that we've all been hearing for the past 30, 40 years, right? You got a baby boom generation that is retiring. That was supposed to be a generation that was filled with a lot of people, and then the generations behind them had less people. So if that generation is retiring, there's less people to fill in. So why wouldn't there be a little bit of a more unique trend going on in the labor markets. But certainly that is one of those gauges that I think the Federal Reserve continues to sort of keep an eye on to help bring perspective to all of this stuff, as we do on a very regular basis. We send out to our clients our usual kind of every 6 to 8 weeks, as the headlines demand, communication, giving some our clients sort of all our thoughts. We're not going to get into all of the details on that because some of that stuff is reserved for clients of Nelson Financial Planning, but I do want to share to our listening audience a little bit of that perspective. And I think it starts with just a couple of things to think about, and that is recessions, because everybody's talking about, I mean, this is probably going to turn into like one of the most widely anticipated recessions in the history of the economy, because if everybody's talking about it, well, then chances are it probably already is in the soup, so to speak. So whether it starts tomorrow or whether it started last week or whatever the case may be, as more people talk about it, it certainly becomes part of the reflection of where the market is, particularly in terms of its current level. So important to remember, in terms of recessions, there's been 48 of them over the last 250 years. So, sort of a normal part of the sequence of events. But here's the key piece, and this was the piece that we shared earlier this week with our clients, is not all recessions are created equal, right? And stop and think about that. The 2008 recession, for example, was a much more dramatic recession than, say, for example, the 1991 recession. And both of those came at particular times in my lifetime. 2008, I had younger kids, had been at Nelson Financial Planning for about 10 years. And so that was sort of the first major, well, that wasn't actually the first major. The first major was 1999 and 2000, 2001. So, but it was one of the major events that happened that was economically related, that created perhaps one of the worst declines in the stock market during that 2008, 2009 period of time. Would also argue that that period of time also was much more dramatic in terms of its scope and impact, right? I think for the most part, the average American did not get through 2008, 2009 completely unscathed. And so if you contrast that with, say, 1991, I was graduating from college. There was certainly a milder recession, couldn't really find a job. Okay, actually wound up going to law school instead of, because I couldn't find a job. So, why not become a completely, worthless lawyer? Anyway, I digress. It's just a joke. Don't take it seriously. Anyway, so the reality is that that's what those two periods of time meant, but both of them were considered recessions. So bottom line, not all recessions are created equal. And remember, recessions are sort of the counter reaction to wringing excesses out of the economic system. Okay, so when we think about the excesses today, largely they're from one source. And we're going to talk about what that source is and help to bring some comparative and sort of wrap all of this up and then shift gears. Coming up next after this break here on Dollars and Cents with Nelson Financial Planning. I'm Joel Garris here on News Channel WFLA. Welcome back to the program. Talking a little bit about some of the current headlines, particularly what's going on in the labor market, sort of underscored by Friday's data that showed that the economy, in the most recent data that shows hiring, added 311,000 jobs. So those kinds of numbers, and we were talking a little bit about this before the break, some of that, in our view, reflects some of the demographics, right? Baby boom generation retiring. That was a generation that had more people than the generations behind it. So some of the employment data that we're seeing could very well be that playing out in real life. The problem with this unemployment data, when things are kind of showing stronger strength, if you will, well, then that forces the Federal Reserve to perhaps continue its rising interest rates, along with potentially even raising those rates back to going up by a half a point rather than on the current course that is a quarter point. So needless to say, that has a tendency to weaken economic conditions. And as we were saying before the break, it's important to remember the 48 recessions that have happened over the last 250 years, they're not all created equal. As we were talking about before the break, the 2008 recession, certainly much more broader and deeper in terms of its impact than, say, the 1991 recession. And so I think it's important to remember when you think about recessions, generally recessions are a means for sort of wringing out the excesses that have accumulated in the prior economic cycle. Well, if we think to the current economic cycle, we would submit that perhaps one of the largest excesses that has contributed to where we are actually correlated back to government spending. The $7 trillion blowout that happened in response to COVID created a lot of the issues that we see today. So when we think about that, that's not necessarily a demonstration of the consumer being, say, overly leveraged like they were in 2008. The consumer, decent shape, still showing by the consumer spending data, that's for sure. And so consequently, they still have some cash. They're still in relatively good shape in terms of their habits. And we think that's sort of an important thing to remember in all of this, is that when you think about sort of what drives the economy, remember, it's about 70% consumers here in this country, about 15% or so government, and the other 15% is corporations. So if 70% is not where the excesses are, and most of that is as a result of the government printing way too much money in response to COVID, then perhaps this one might not be, or this recession, whenever it is, next week or last week or whenever it is, that at the end of the day, it probably won't be as bad as some of the others. So important to kind of remember that perspective, along with the other thing that we mentioned in a communication we sent to our clients this past week. Remember, the markets are forward-looking. They're pretty efficient. Markets price things pretty efficiently, and in fact, sometimes price them too efficiently, too quickly. But the reality is that markets typically look out 6 to 9 months ahead, and so are very much pricing in what is currently in the current headlines, or the speculation, should we say, that is currently in the headlines, which is, yes, there's some recession coming. Did it already happen? Did it already start? Who knows? It's an exercise that they determine after the fact. But the important thing to remember is that it's a normal part of the cycle, and they are not all created equal. 48 over the past 250 years would suggest that you probably don't want to shift around your investment strategy in reaction to what you think may or may not happen. Far more important to be consistent, be diversified, and rebalance along the way. Those are some tried and true investment approaches that ultimately over time have shown that they work. So welcome on into the program. This, of course, is Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where our team of certified financial fiduciaries stands ready this week to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. Speaking of having a successful financial plan, this next statistic may disturb you because it underscores that a lot of people don't have that, particularly considering that there has been a 40% jump in the number of folks taking hardship withdrawals from 401ks compared to levels that were sort of pre-COVID. Combined with that, the actual amount that is getting withdrawn is about 30% more over just a year ago. So there's a lot of issues that are in there and a lot of concerns. Most importantly is trying to figure out a way in which you can avoid that. Because the biggest issue of what that really represents when you have to go to your 401k for a hardship withdrawal is that fundamentally that's sort of an admission that you don't really have an emergency savings account. And it is shocking how often people don't have that. And That's sort of the number one thing, if you will. Folks come into the office and say, okay, how do I get started? What do I need to do? And we start having the conversation of, okay, well, what's the rest of the picture look like? What do you do? How much earnings? What you owe? What you own? And then we ask the question, okay, well, how much you got in savings? And it's like $2,000. And so that's not going to be enough for a real emergency. So the very first thing you can do to avoid using your 401k as an emergency savings piggy bank is to actually establish an emergency savings account. An account that is, just cash, just money sitting in a savings account. It's not supposed to be invested. It's not supposed to be fluctuating, but it is supposed to be there so that you can access it. And at the end of the day, have those resources that you can turn to in the event of an emergency. So that really is step one, if you will, in the process. If you're trying to get started, trying to figure out, okay, how do I achieve financial success over time? What's step one? Step one, make sure you got an emergency savings account. The other issue, which is part of this trend that we're concerned about, particularly this jump up in hardship withdrawals for 401ks, is, as is often the case, the folks in Washington are sort of talking out both sides of their mouth, right? So they've done a lot of efforts over the past few years to encourage and sort of protect retirement accounts, right? There was the Secure Act, and then there was the Secure Act 2.0. The Secure Act has a great title. It's secure setting every community up for retirement enhancement. That's what secure means. So we're going through all of this. We're passing all these legislations. And then at the same time, the government proceeds to loosen the rules for accessing retirement monies, particularly with respect to hardship withdrawals, which may very well explain why there's been a spike up in them. It started in 2018, where there was a law passed that said that hardship withdrawals allowed people to access not just their contributions, which had always been the case before, but also their earnings. 2020, COVID took it even further. You can take $100,000 out and you don't have to worry about any tax penalty, and you can pay the taxes back over the course of the past 3 years. That trend continued further in December, this past December, when now you're no longer requiring to have hardship withdrawals to even show proof of duress. It really expanded out the hardship withdrawal options to be much broader than sort of the traditional things that you had to show and prove in order to get a hardship withdrawal. So government at the end of the day trying to kind of have it both ways, and I just think that's not the right approach. If you want to encourage people to do the right thing and save more and secure everybody's retirement or set every community up for retirement enhancement, then why not go on a public campaign of what kind of step one is in all of this? You can't encourage folks to be less accountable. You can't, say we want to set everybody up for secure retirement and then at the same point loosen up the rules that allows you to access and use your 401k like an emergency savings bank. Why don't you just set it up and say, hey, we're going to encourage people to actually have an emergency savings account. Seems to me that would be much more responsible to have someone accountable and to set up some guardrails rather than just open up the pantry doors and say, have at it. We've got one other thought on this topic, but we got to take a break. When we return here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. So Biden announces his budget filled with all kinds of items, and believe you, we will certainly have a full breakdown on those on our next episode here on Dollars and Cents. But I wanted to set that conversation up with the other little information that recently got released, and that is the data from the folks at the Internal Revenue Service. And so the data from the folks at the Internal Revenue Service is something that they issue out on a regular basis that takes and combines all of the information on all of the tax returns that were filed with the IRS. So obviously the data that they just released isn't exactly 2022 data because people are still in the process of filing those tax returns, and they haven't really finished processing 2021. There's still several million returns out there that they haven't finished processing. So anyway, the data that they released had to deal with the calendar year 2020. And the reality is that the results may very well surprise you. It certainly calls into question some of the little sort of snippets, if you will, or the three-word mantras that seem to be kicked around on a regular basis out there, right? The three words, tax the rich, tax the rich. The problems in this country are not so great or not so easily solved that you can come up with a three-word slogan and think that you're going to somehow solve the problem. Because when you start to hear the data, you may question, like, how are we going to do that? Because Americans should fundamentally be quite worried about the impact of this approach, because ultimately the impact impacts everybody. Here's the data that the folks at the IRS recently reviewed, along with some interesting perspective of where the same data was 20 years ago. So buckle up your seatbelts. Here we go. Welcome on in to Dollars and Cents. This, of course, is where we help you make sense out of all of those different decisions that have anything to do with your dollars. My name, of course, Joel Garris. You're listening to a program that is one of the top 25 financial planning podcasts on the World Wide Web, coming to you on a variety of stations throughout the Central Florida region. I'm a certified financial planner, certified financial fiduciary at Nelson Financial Planning, where we got a team of great folks, all of whom happen to be certified financial fiduciaries as well, that stand ready to help you change your life with a successful and cost-effective financial plan. So here's the numbers. Here's the data. Internal Revenue, and we're going to read it so we don't miss any of the data. The Internal Revenue Service recently released its income and tax statistics for 2020. Top 1% of earners, take a guess at the percentage of the country's income taxes that they pay. 20%? 30%? Maybe a third, right? Nope. 42.3%. Top 1%. Pay 42.3% of the country's income taxes. The same 1%, just to kind of see what the data numbers, the hard numbers are, reported earnings of 22% of adjusted gross income. So if you're looking at the math, the share of taxes paid by the top 1% as a group is roughly double their share of income. Top 1%, effectively reporting about 22% of cumulative adjusted gross income on tax returns for the year 2020. Meanwhile, that group pays 42.3% of all tax revenue. No matter how you slice that, let's be very clear that the tax system in the United States is a steeply progressive system. You made 22% of the total adjusted gross income, but yet you're paying 42% of the total income tax payments. So those are the numbers. Let's continue on and dig a little bit deeper. And this is where it, picks up other people. The top 5% of earners reported about 38% of a total adjusted gross income, but paid 62% of all income taxes. So now, so we talked about the top 1. Okay, now we're talking about the top 5% of earners reporting 38% of the total adjusted gross income, but paying 62.7% of all income taxes. For comparison purposes, the bottom 50% of earners reported about 10% of total accumulated adjusted gross income and paid 2.3% of all income taxes. How does that compare to these same statistics from 20 years ago? Well, in 2001, the top 1% contributed about 33% of all income tax revenue, or about a third, effectively about 9 points lower than the 42.3% that they now contribute in 2020. Similarly, the share of income taxes paid by lower income earners, The bottom 50% in the year 2001 provided about 4.9% of the total revenue versus 2.3 today. And certainly those are just some of the numbers that the IRS released against this backdrop of then this grand budget that gets rolled out. So the question you have to ask yourself is, well, where's the money going to come from? Because top 1% is paying 43, top 5% is paying 63% of all income taxes. Top 5, 63% of all. Then, like, how much more is there, lest we want to, become France or something, to actually generate revenue that's going to solve these issues? And I think this is a problem, and this isn't intended to be some partisan rant of any kind. This is a problem, and if you're a long-time listener to the program, you know that we have disdain for politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, because of their inability to try and address the real problems in today's society. Look, we had Rob Field on this program last week talking about Social Security, massive projected shortfall. Second only to the massive projected shortfall, which is 7 times greater projected shortfall over the same time period for Medicare and Medicaid. These are real issues that aren't just magically going to go away. They require real conversations, serious conversations about give and take, about trying to come up to a solution that, at the end of the day, no solution is ever going to be perfect. No solution is ever going to make everybody happy. But at the end of the day, we need to have these conversations rather than just throwing around 3-word slogans, tax the rich, and somehow you think that that's going to ultimately solve the problem. It won't, especially when you actually look at the real data that is being actually produced out of the IRS. So compare that to the data from the IRS. Like, how are you going to get there with your 3-word slogan? Because top 5% already pays nearly 2/3 of all tax revenue that comes in to the government coffers. So what else you thinking about doing there anyway? That's the background. That's the background on the hard numbers. And don't you just hate it when the hard numbers just kind of buck right up against kind of some of the slogans and the sound bites that you hear? But at the end of the day, whether it's government finances or whether it's your finances, it comes down to the ones and the zeros, the actual numbers. And we talk about this all the time on the program. You want to make a financial decision? You want to make a good financial decision? Run the numbers and see how they come out. It'll tell you a lot of exactly what you can and what you can't do. And certainly these numbers, courtesy of the IRS, would suggest that maybe there is some other way to engage in this conversation that might actually create a solution, because it's hard to ignore these projected shortfalls, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. That's really where the greater projected shortfalls are, 7 times greater when you look at Medicare and Medicaid versus Social Security over the same time period. So anyway, next week on the program, we will have a fuller breakdown on some of the tax proposals that are in the Biden plan. We'll tell you which ones to kind of keep an eye on and which ones to just kind of ignore perhaps along the way. That'll be on next week's program. In the meantime, we're going to take a break on this week's program, and when we return, we're going to circle back to that 401k hardship withdrawal discussion we were having earlier in the program. Coming up next here on Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. During the break, Lizzie and I were chatting a little bit. The reality is, you know how we know if the folks in government can actually come up to a real solution? If everybody walks away just a little bit unsatisfied with the deal. Because that's what negotiation and horse trading is all about. But for somehow, the folks in Washington seem to have lost that skill along the way. No compromise, no solution to these problems is going to satisfy everybody. It's not. You're going to be a little disappointed about certain things. Everybody's going to be a little disappointed about certain things. But if in the grand picture, we're able to ultimately get to a solution that's for the good and the betterment of the country, then that's what it's all about. But you're never going to get everything. It's not how it works, or it shouldn't be how it works. You got way too many politicians thinking that they're going to get everything and not really willing to engage in a conversation. Anyway, we're going to shift gears, get off the political rant, if you will, which, comes right up front and center with the actual data. Back to the hardship withdrawals on the 401ks. We wanted to just circle back on that one because I did have a parting thought and I got sidetracked on the IRS tax data. If you're going to take money out of your 401k, if that really is the only place where you're like, okay, Joel, I get it. I haven't set up an emergency savings account. I know I have to do that, but you know what? I got some issues and I got to deal with it now, and I'm going to go to my 401k. Okay. But know that you have two options, one of which holds you a little bit more accountable than the other. Because when you take money out of a 401k, you do have two options. One of them is a hardship withdrawal. That's a straight withdrawal. The other is a loan. And loans typically are a little bit more limited, capped at 50% of the balance. You can only take up to $50,000. Most importantly, on a loan, there is a required mechanism for paying back that loan. Now, don't get me wrong, not a particularly big fan of loans either, because that means that the contributions that you're making are just paying back the money that should have already been in the account, but it got taken out. So from that perspective, you certainly want to take a minute and make sure that you're not taking too much out of the 401k. But understand that there's a difference between hardship withdrawals and loans. Loans, in our opinion, if you have to go there, give yourself a little bit more accountability, put up a little bit more guardrails in terms of using that money because you're required to ultimately pay it back. So understand the difference between the two and ultimately how that plays out. Bottom line, as we said earlier in the program, it starts with having a savings account. It starts with having an emergency savings account. That's the very first thing that you need to do if you're trying to establish yourself and trying to get yourself on a successful financial path. Start with that emergency savings account. And that just means exactly that, having a little bit of extra money in the bank in the savings account and having that to be ready and accessible at any point in time. Speaking of points and points that we like to make, we encourage you to check out our blog posts for the month of March. We do monthly blog posts on our website at Nelson Financial Planning, so we encourage you to check out the latest. It's a little bit about some of the latest things going on the tax side, along with some burgeoning, big word right there, tax themes for the year 2023. Among the things to know for tax season, for example, the deadline, not April 15, it actually is April 18. Once again, the calendar kind of falls wonkily. We got a weekend in there, and then we got some holiday, and so consequently, it's actually April 18th. We said this earlier in the program, and I'm going to just highlight this next item that we mentioned in the blog post, because one of the things that we said earlier is don't rush to try and file your taxes. Why? Because a lot of the forms aren't finalized, or enough of the forms aren't finalized that it may dramatically impact your tax return. And specifically, there's one form that is not yet finalized that applies directly to us here in Florida. Hurricane Ian, as you may well imagine, required a lot of the state of Florida to be declared a federally declared disaster area. And when that happens, that means that if you needed to use your money out of your retirement account, out of your IRA, up to $22,000 is the cap on that, then there is no penalty for the early withdrawal on that. And again, not necessarily advocating that as a solution, but yeah, if you lost your house, you lost your roof, or whatever the case may be, a lot of folks here in Central Florida had extensive tree cleanup. I mean, the numbers that some of our clients are sharing with us in terms of, up into land and all other parts, I had to pay $10,000 to have all these trees cleaned up. That is a real financial constraint. And so to the extent that you utilized your retirement account for that, Typically, if you were under age 59 and a half, there would be a 10% penalty. But because Florida was declared a federally disaster area, there's actually a form that you can put on your tax return to get that penalty waived. Now, you still got to pay the taxes on it, but there's an opportunity to waive the penalty with the use of that form. Unfortunately, the form is not finalized because the IRS is still putting out different drafts of this form. So if you file your taxes and you didn't realize about this form because this form is not finalized, then you may very well wind up paying the penalty when otherwise you wouldn't have to. So I think that is just a very good example that directly applies to us here in Florida of why you want to make sure that all of the potential forms that you might use on your tax return are in fact finalized. This is just one of many that the IRS is still kind of tinkering around with, still issuing out versions, still not in the mix that you need to be aware of, particularly as it relates to us here in Florida and particularly to IRA withdrawals for those folks that are under age 59 and a half. So bottom line, don't rush on the notion of filing the return. You want to make sure that all of the forms are certainly ready and able to be finalized before you wind up filing the return. As we've said repeatedly, refund smaller. That goes without saying because of the child tax credits, dependent care credits that have gone away. And then, of course, as we like to say, don't bother to call the IRS because no one's probably going to answer you. So those are the kinds of things that we talked about in the most recent blog post on our website at Nelson Financial Planning. Also, same blog post, we talked about some of the investment themes, that carry over from 2022, things like this notion of an interest rates versus inflation, the concept of value versus growth, dividend-paying companies versus technology companies. Dividend-paying companies obviously had a much better year than technology companies, and that theme sort of seems to be carrying over into this year. But certainly some new ones for the year 2023. When we look at performance on the bond side, bonds sort of like stocks in that when they have a bad year, usually that bad year is followed by a good year. And you're starting to see that in some places in the bond market. Similarly, the importance of dividends, right? We've certainly talked about that before on the program. Dividends make up almost half of the return of the overall markets over the course of the past 80 odd years. So it's certainly an important part of the portfolio. So those are some of the things that we talk about in the blog post. For more, go to our website, Nelson Financial Planning, and check out the blog post for the month of March. All of that stuff is in there. And the music means that we got to wrap it on up. That's about it for this week's episode of Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. If you like what you heard and want to learn more, we encourage you to reach out to one of our certified financial fiduciaries at Nelson Financial Planning. Go to our website, nelsonfinancialplanning.com, or you can even call the office 407-629-6477. We look forward to seeing how we can help you achieve your financial goals. Thank you for listening to the program. This has been Dollars and Cents with Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning.